Welcome into Boxing Scene Today here at the Pro Box TV studios. One thing about the boxing world, we all know about the 10 count. When boxing loses one of its own, it's like we lost a member of our family. Italians and Italian Americans lost a legend in the boxing community. To help me break it down, Jimmy Smith alongside the champs, Chris Algieri, Paulie Malignaggi, also the coach, Robert Garcia. Paulie, I'm going to let you break it down. You say the name, you give it the respect.
Nino Benvenuti.
Nino Benvenuti, one of the greatest of all time from Italy. At one point, 65-0. We were researching it this morning. Great middleweight, a world champion, a class act. From everything I'm reading, everyone who had an interaction with him said he was absolute class. Paulie, paisan of yours, we're going to talk about the great Italians and Italian-American boxers of today. What does a guy like this mean, man? You as a, you were born in Italy, you're Italian-American. What does that guy like that mean to you?
For boxing, the Benvenuti, if you look at even his image in Italy, he's probably the most well-known boxer in Italian history. I know there's guys like Primo Carnera and guys like that, from Italy, and there's also been some very good boxers that we'll get into in a bit from Italy. But Benvenuti transcended more the culture worldwide. There were other world champions in Italy, but Benvenuti, I don't know, it was a matter of charisma, image, championship caliber, because he had a lot of big fights and big wins even on American soil. He also had a post-fight career where he was an analyst and a TV guy like ourselves, and carried himself very well. His public image and brand was carried very well in Italy throughout his life. I was at live events in the last 10 years where he was still, calling fights. So he lasted into the business for a long time into his life after having a Hall of Fame caliber championship career. So for boxing and for Italians, obviously, because that's where the culture is closer to, it's a big loss. It may be the biggest loss in terms of speaking boxing people for Italians.
I mean, essentially, he's the golden boy of Italian boxing.
Yeah,
won the gold in Rome.
And exactly, I was going to say,
crazy.
In Rome, he won at the same Olympics as Ali, mind you.
That too, and he got fighter of the tournament.
Yeah.
Actually, so over Ali. So it was just. I mean, like I said, he's the golden boy of Italian boxing, like you said, and we'll go into that in a bit. Guys who were actually born there, but I mean, 2-division world champion, undisputed, record's incredible, and he had 3 losses at the very end of his career, so his record's actually even better than was. What
2 were Monzon.
And 2
were Carlos Monzon, probably the greatest middleweight of all time.
His reign actually took Monzon to end his reign. You needed a guy like Monzon. Benvenuti had a nice reign at the top, and it took Monzon to end him. And I'll get into the story. I've told Chris the story about, my grandfather was a huge Benvenuti fan.
And Monzon
was a heartbreaker.
Monzon really did end him, because the first fight, the first fight's awesome, but then after that, he was just
he didn't have any fight with him anymore for the second one. He just didn't have it.
But he was getting stopped by other guys too, who just were not on the level anymore. Yeah. So some fights just really take it at
you, especially after you've been there so long, and Benvenuti had by that point.
Yeah, so Coach, please tell us about, end of an era, man. As a coach who's been in the game as long as you have, you remember these old school guys. Is it a bit of an end of an era when a guy like this goes, man?
Definitely, when somebody like that goes, especially like Paulie was saying, he never left boxing. He was always in the after his career as a boxer, commentating and doing stuff like that, and always involved in boxing. From a country that's actually been great in boxing with some great fighters, great legends. It's something that we can't really expect until we see it. Us, Mexican Americans. Imagine the day Julio Cesar Chavez goes. It's going. He's the legend. He's the one everybody loves. Other fighters leave the sport. We have guys that are big names, that were big names in their time, but after they retired, never were involved in boxing, never did any commentating, never did any interviews. So people kind of tend to forget about them. Not in this case. We have he was always involved. He always did the commentating, and that's what hurts more, because people kept seeing about him, kept hearing about him. He kept his opinion going, and that means a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Paul, a name in Italian boxing even after his career was over. Let's discuss some other guys from Italy. Your history, Paul. One I remember growing up, Vito Antuofermo, who kind of is known for, unfortunately, launching the career of Marvelous Marvin Hagler the way maybe Benvenuti launched the career of Carlos Monzon.
Yeah.
First off, got the draw, that was declared when Hagler beat him. But it was almost like Hagler at that point went, I'm never getting a draw again. And it launched Hagler. And Vito Antuofermo was on the wrong side of that. But a real warrior, man. I remember his fights just being.
You look at Antuofermo, he wasn't really the most talented guy, right?
Rough bricklayer.
He had,
and like Hagler, in a sense.
Vito will tell you, he's like, I was born with flat feet. I had to, I'm flat-footed. So it's like literally flat feet. His feet had no curve. So he's never gonna have the footwork. He was not the biggest puncher, so he had a lot of heart and a lot of toughness, and really achieved a lot in his career. When you consider the lack of natural gifts that he was given, a super stern guy. Obviously, was world middleweight champion, Italian-born, but like Benvenuti, also came to America and plied his trade in America on these shores and had some big fights, and also like Benvenuti had a good image outside of boxing, outside of the ring as well. Was in a couple of classic movies. We like to quote it once in a while here. He was in Goodfellas. He was in The Godfather Part 3. And
in Sopranos too. Was in early episodes.
May have been a Sopranos too.
One of the.
And also, he was a staple in the New York community, Italian American community. I used to see him at the various feasts. Up until in the last few years,
San Gennaro, stuff like that.
He's a little bit of dementia now, so he's kind of going. But Vito, he was in the community, and he was like a regular part of the community. I've been around him and his friends. It's funny because I always talk about my buddy Pete. He was like my right hand man. Vito had a guy like that too. And I've been around him, and I've been around them with their stories. Like, I remember I was hanging out with them like about 10 years ago. There was some stories, bro. The '80s were even better. You know what I mean? Like, I thought I had wild stories with my best friend, but you got those in the '80s, bro. The parties are better. Everything's better. So Vito, he was a staple in the community, which I really liked, and of course, championship fighter and all that other stuff, and gets that respect. So, another Italian-born fighter that we definitely deserves his mention and honor when it comes to Italian fighters and the Italian history of boxing.
When it comes to Italian-born fighters, our generation, I'm a little older than you guys, but you got to go. When I was growing up, Arturo Gatti, Boom Boom Mancini, probably the most popular and most fan-friendly fighters of our era, Chris, when we were growing up.
Can somebody tell me if Arturo, I've heard different stories, if Arturo was born in Montreal, if he's born in Italy.
I've heard
born in Italy, went to Montreal
as 2 years old or something like that.
I'm looking it up right
now. With Boom Boom, he's born in Youngstown, Ohio.
Born in Youngstown, Ohio, of Italian descent. Yeah, exactly. But two of the most entertaining of our generation.
Yeah, well, those guys
growing up,
those two specifically, they transcended their accomplishments with their personalities and their draw. The people loved them. They were those guys who were bleeding heart fighters. They went out there, it was blood and guts. They left everything on the line, and it endeared them to the fans. So those two, more so than a lot of the other guys that we're going to talk about today. Because listen, I did extensive research on this. God, there's a lot of really good Italian fighters both from born in Italy and those that did their work over here, and some who were born here as well. But those two specifically, I mean, it was kind of like Mancini was like the TV era. He comes on, now we're all seeing him. He's stateside. Arturo kept that going. Yeah, that was like big pay-per-view, because he came up on pay-per-view undercards. And he was on Tyson cards, on De La Hoya cards.
And in between that, you had Vinny Pazienza.
And Vinny Paz.
They were like the modern.
He was another one who left it all on the line and endeared himself to the fans, but also like it was his antics too.
Yeah,
Arturo's antics were with the police.
but chases.
Yeah. But his fight though was blood and guts. Knock me down, cut my eye, close up my eye, bleed I'm still knocking you out, kind of thing. Ray was just all blood and guts, and was just he was like a little engine that could. He's always pushing. But Vinny, man.
But the Cuisine culture, they like that kind of stuff.
They love that.
Oh, yeah.
Love that kind of stuff. Vinny was on a different level, though. Vinny was
like Rocky.
He's crazy.
Vinny's crazy. Vinny was the perfect blend of the 80s into the 90s nightclub scene.
Yeah,
he was
and he used to date Penthouse Pets.
But Robert, I got to know, as a coach, you're Mexican-American. It seems like even before kind of, the Mexican-American machismo, the Italianissimo kind of style was, in the 50s and 60s into the 70s and 80s was almost a similar kind of style. I remember Vinny Paz fighting Roy Jones Jr. and begging the fight not to be stopped when he almost got killed. And he went, "Don't stop it." I'm like, dude, you're about to die in there. But that's how
the guy.
Right. That's how Italian Americans and Italian fighters were, man. What do you think of that?
Look, it's very similar, very, very similar to Mexicans. Same thing. They rather die in the ring than have their corner or the doctor or the ref stop the fight. It's just very, very similar. I remember there was a Arturo Gatti fight where there was a big cut where the doctor told him, I could already see the bone. And then he responds, "Well, that's good. That means he's not going to get any deeper." So, stuff like that is something that, you just can't match. There's not, Italians, Mexicans, they'll die in the ring. That's their mentality, and sometimes sometimes we might think it's a little bit too much, but that's just the way it is. And that's why people love them. That's why we love them. That's why, me, myself, I have a, personal thing that I want to mention with Arturo Gatti. I was ranked number 1 in the IBF when he was champion. Lucky for me, he vacated the title, and I won the vacant title. But I was supposed to fight him when he was champion at 130 pounds. I was his mandatory, but he moved up to lightweight, and I picked up the vacant title. But imagine, it would have been crazy just
That would have been a good fight,
with
Robert.
Arturo
Yeah.
Gatti.
I'm
Back
sorry
then.
we never saw that actually. Yeah.
Looking back, because you had that in your face mentality too when it came in the
You
fight.
were both boxer punchers. Like
Yeah.
you both could box. You both had good technique.
That would have been a fun, and especially
Arturo 130 was,
and
was a different
especially
guy.
he had just beaten Ruelas. It would have built up the rivalry with
Yeah.
the Mexican American coming in. It would have. Man, he should have stayed at 130. One
Yeah,
more
he
fight.
hit
man.
the Wilson Rodriguez, the Gabriel.
Then he
Morales
lost. He
fight.
ended up going up to lightweight and losing to Manfredi. Robert, I
Angel
remember you
Manfredi.
won that title. I remember you were the guy who won the IBF title right after Arturo. Yep, I remember that. Yep.
But
Full circle.
when you look at it, Paulie, as an Italian American yourself, is there a difference? And by the way, Arturo Gatti, born in Montreal of Italian descent, is there a difference in style between those homegrown Italian fighters and like an Italian American fighter? Is it different?
When Robert was talking about that, it made me think of for a second. It's funny because the Italian American culture historically brought fighters that were more in your face, more brawlers, more bangers. You did have your Willie Peps and you had your stylists like that, but overall, the Italian American culture were more face first fighters. Bangers. I think it's the hunger culture at that
More
time.
LaMotta.
LaMotta, Rocky Graziano types, Rocky Marciano types, and so on and so forth. And I think that's just the hunger culture because at that time, the Italian Americans were sort of the, in the lower rungs of the communities in America. So you're trying to fight your way out of poverty and you're fighting with that mentality. If you look at the Italians, even back then, more stylists, like your Benvenutis of the world and
Even now, like
Even-
Soviet, Bronco, Gianluca Bronco.
they're more technicians than anything else. While the Italian Americans now are almost non-existent in boxing, but a lot of some of them do go to MMA though. But regardless, you had that in your face style, even in modern day, like more modern day, not modern day, but closer to modern day, like the guys we mentioned, Mancini, Gotti, Pazienza, who was a mixture of the two. So I do think there was a just like in regular Italian culture and Italian American culture, I always say it's like they're cousins. They're not definitely the same. And Robert, I don't know if it's like that with Mexican too. I don't know if the Mexicans in Mexico feel like they're more Mexican than the Mexican Americans. But in Italy, we always have this debate, because Italians in Italy think they're different than us, Italian Americans. And I got to the point where I say, you know what? We are different. We're similar. The root is the same. The root culture is the same. But then there's, various.
We have our coffee difference.
Various differences. Even though the root stays the same, and I think that even with boxing, it was like that. There's boxers from Italy and boxers from Italian American boxers, but you see the immigrant culture creates that famine, that hunger, that violence, more violent type of fighter. I do want to mention a couple of Italian-born fighters that don't get as much shine here, but are probably the second and third most known Italian fighters in Italy that with respect. I know here we mentioned Carnero because he's a heavyweight and whatnot.
Primo Carnero.
But in Italy, the top guys, if you mention the most boxing fans, the top Italian Italian-born fighters in Italy ever are Benvenuti, Duilio Loi, and Sandro Mazzinghi. And Mazzingi's reign actually was ended by Benvenuti. Benvenuti lost, I think, a couple of fights. Mazzinghi lost a couple of fights to Benvenuti, but Mazzinghi's career only had 3 losses as well. I think 2 of them were to Benvenuti.
Wow.
Duilio Loi had like 100 wins and like 3 losses, something like that, and was world champion at lightweight and 140 pounds. Very, very good fighter. Very, very good technician as well. Doesn't get as much shine here, but, Loi was beat Carlos Ortiz 2 out of 3 times in the San Siro Stadium where AC Milan and Inter Milan play, 50, 60,000 people, and they were filling up those stadiums and so on and so forth. But I think because I don't think he ever made his way here, he doesn't get as much shine, but Loi was a very, very good fighter. But, to go back to the comparison of cultures, I think you see the hunger mentality and the more tactical, finesse European
The
mentality.
European style of boxing, technically really good.
Because even Benvenuti, he came to America, but you can see he had that technical high style like a European. While around the same era, maybe just before, LaMotta was in the same weight class trying to bulldoze you. You know what I mean? and he's Italian. He's more the Italian American style.
Yeah, no. So Robert, I remember distinctly being from Southern California. De La Hoya versus Chavez was very who's more Mexican. I remember when every time that fight came up, it was about as Paulie said, are you Mexican? Are you Mexican American? Are you both? Are you not? That was a big debate at the time.
It's always been a big debate, here in Southern California, at least where we're from. We are first generation, and we're raised. We grew up as Mexicans, speaking Spanish, our first language. We learn English in schools, and even schools, there's nothing but English. But in Mexico, they don't see us as Mexicans. They do see us as Americans. Mexicans don't see us as they see us as as Americans. They don't take us as their own. Even though we feel like that. Every time we have a national soccer game, we put on our Mexican jersey, but they it's just different the way the way Paulie was saying about Italy. Same thing, Paulie. We don't get that recognition as Mexicans. I consider myself the first Mexican to win the Trainer of the Year in 2012. But
in Mexico, they said no.
I'm not because I believe Eddie Reynoso became the first one after me. But it's just the way it is. They don't see us as full Mexicans.
But you know what it is, Robert? As I got older, because there's a lot of similarities with when I moved to California, I realized there's a lot of similarities with first generation Mexican and first generation Mexican American and first generation Italian American. Super similar cultures, and of course the back home cultures, the Mexican and Italian cultures. And I realized something. I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, it's very similar, because as the language gets lost, the home country starts to respect you less, right? And so I when I moved to California, because when I was in New York, I thought all the Mexicans spoke Spanish. I didn't really see Latinos that didn't speak Spanish until I went to California, and I was like, wow, I was like, there's Latinos here that don't speak Spanish,
It doesn't take long. The generations,
and that's the thing, That's the problem Italians had in New York. I speak Italian, but a lot of Italian Americans no longer spoke Italian.
Yeah.
So, and that was sort of the vibe that the Italians gave us. The Italian American culture was, you speak the language. But I don't know, Robert, if you guys have this too with the Mexican culture and Mexican American culture. I always felt like Italian American culture was more attached to the roots of the culture, while back home the culture, while Italians always felt like they were more Italian, they're too busy trying to become Americanized, because of the internet and everything else. You're like, and I would look at them, and as I got older, I'm like, bro, you know what? I am not Italian. I am an Italian American. You know what? I'm happy with that, because I would rather be with a culture that is still attached to the roots than be with a culture that is from the homeland, but yet is trying so hard to be American. You know what I mean? Like, where
the grass is always green. Right?
You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, you're Italian, but you're keeping none of the traditions. You're making them die away. So I don't know how it is like that with the Mexicans and Mexican Americans, Robert. But in the end, I just accepted my identity. And I love my Italians when I go there. I'm first generation, like Robert, who's first generation. We still speak our language, so it gives us an insight into both. Because I think once you go into second and third generation, you start to lose the insight into the home culture. You're angling more one way. While I think the first generation, that has the closest insight to both, because we are speaking the language. We have our parents born there, so we are still close to the culture. But at the same time, we're in America, so we understand the American culture too. So you get a little bit of insight into both. And so I can see the arguments from both sides.
Well, people don't get, like, my brother is as white as I am. He speaks fluent Spanish. We grew up in Southern California. He took it in school, but he uses it all the time. And we would go to neighborhoods in LA. My mom's a great cook, and she'd look for these certain things. You only get in like Boyle Heights. You only get in East LA. My brother translated everywhere we went.
Now,
it's almost like there are areas in LA where it's like it's real helpful.
If you go to South Beach, you better know how to speak Spanish.
Yeah,
100%.
If you go to Miami Airport,
Right? Yeah, my wife's Cuban. Yeah, same deal. Yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. Was there any? What I'm curious about this, Chris. You have Italian heritage. is there pressure to fight like an Italian, like American fans expected growing up? Is there any of that, Paulie, for either one of you guys?
They do want you to be Rocky in some ways.
Yeah, does everybody want you to be Rocky?
So when I beat Ruslan, whose nickname was the Siberian Rocky, my promoter at the time, Joe DeGuardi, was like, we're gonna call you, the real Rocky, the real. I'm like, no, I'm not a Rocky. I don't fight like Rocky. I box, dude. I'm a boxer. He's like, no, I'm gonna call you the real Rocky. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to. I'm not that guy. I know you want me to be that guy and whatever, but like.
And Willie Pep was a really good boxer.
The greatest defensive fighter of all time.
Until I got older, I hadn't seen a lot of
his footwork.
Willie Pep was a really advanced boxer for those times. Because in those times, there was essentially some black fighters, not even all the black fighters, only some black fighters were stylists. You know? I mean,
the guy who beat Willie all the time was Sandy Sadler. He was a beast.
Yeah.
He was just a ghoul.
What I'm saying is not even
he would grapple.
not even all the black fighters were stylists at the time. Some of them were bangers too, it's like the culturally you hadn't tied into your strengths yet, and so most people were just more brawlers, even like your Joe Lewis's were very
I was going to say that, Paulie, when you were talking about the styles of the fighters where the Italians who fought more of the European style, and then you had the Italian Americans over here who fought more of that grind. I think that was more just a sign of the times than the actual oh no, those guys made it because they came over. Maybe and partly because obviously they're literally first generation here, and you just don't have the same things available to you. But I think it was just more of a sign of the times. What's so impressive about Willie Pep is that. And also Gene Tunney was another guy who was obviously not Italian.
Fantastic boxer.
Who they used their style. They fought the norm. They went against the tide. Even though those were what the popular fighters look like, no, I'm better at this. That's what was going to be my answer. Be like, well, when people wanted you to fight more like that, I was like, no, I'm good. I don't want to get punched in my face like that. I'm gonna stick and move. I'm gonna hit and don't be hit. I don't care what you want me to do as a crowd, as the fans are. I'm gonna fight. I'm gonna fight what works for me. So guys like Willie Pep, like Gene Tunney, who again not Italian, for them to be able to stick to their guns and make their style work, especially the way Willie Pep got it to work, and two-time world champion, and
even Benvenuti, right? I mean, ultimately, he was a very stylistic fighter, but he ended up, there was some tough physical fights that he ended up being. He had to beat Emil Griffith. He had to fight somebody
twice. I think they fought three times.
Twice.
Another reason why he was a good analyst afterwards, because he could box and he could fight, and he was fought at the highest level.
Fought when he had to, and again, you have to have a little bit of both, and I think Coach Garcia will also, attest to that. You have to have that dog in you, regardless of how much of a stylist you want to be. There has to be times in a fight where you may have to bring the dog out of you.
The best fighters turned broadcasters, if you look, they're always the stylists. You look at the Andre Ward, Tim Bradley,
Roy Jones,
Roy Jones Jr., those guys. And then even George Foreman, who was really good in the second half of his career. He was more of a stylist in the second half of his career. He could punch, but he was much more aware, set things up.
Tactical.
Much more tactical, yeah. Right.
What do you learn, Robert? Do you ever talk to your guys about those old school guys? The guys we're talking about, the Willie Peps. When you're dealing with a generation who might not know who that is, what do you teach them from those old school guys, man, the old Italians?
We all know and we all remember, but all the new generations, they're not too much into it anymore. I tell all my fathers, you guys got to go back and watch some Orlando Canizales type of fighters. I used to love boxers. Footwork. I love footwork. Ray Leonard, Orlando Canizales, Finito Lopez. I tell my fighters, you guys got to watch stuff. Fighters like that. But they're more in, the new stuff, the new generations. But we grew up. It was just a different way of life. Here in Southern California, at least, we grew up pretty much Mexican, so everything was the way Mexico, or the food especially, is nothing but Mexican food over here in Southern California. And the boxing style, everybody grew up wanting to be like Chavez, like Pipino Cuevas, like you know what I mean? Those legends from Mexico, Puas Olivares, who were all brawlers and punchers and going to wars. I try to get my fighters to watch videos, but it's tough. They just
everything's so distracted nowadays with these phones.
Robert, I go through that all the time. I try and talk to these young fighters. They don't even remember fighters from a generation ago. Even early 2000s
span is gone.
They don't even know fighters from early 2000s.
The attention
before Floyd, it's like, I've heard of them.
The attention span is gone.
It's a real.
I want to mention one more Italian American.
We got a couple that we have to throw out.
One more Italian, actually, not Italian, one more Italian that was in closest to this generation. recognition. And he was 2-time WBO champion, which, WBO didn't get as much recognition back in the day, but Giovanni Parisi, and he won 12 rounds with Chavez, who's arguably the best Mexican fighter ever. Lost to Chavez. That's sort of a claim to fame when you go 12 rounds with Chavez back in
prime Chavez.
The Chavez heyday. But Parisi had an interesting story. Rest in peace to Giovanni Parisi. He ended up dying in an auto accident, only 41 years old. But Parisi was not the Olympic representative in the 1988 Olympics for Italy. He'd been beaten in the trials, and Michele Caldarello, who's from my hometown of Syracuse, had qualified for the 1988 Olympics. Caldarello ends up getting an injury, which actually ended his boxing career. He ended up becoming a coach for now he's in the Italian national system in the amateurs. He was coaching the women's team. Now I don't know what he's doing now, but he's out there, and he was in the Olympic. Parisi comes in as the alternate and then wins the gold medal in 1988. And it catapults him, to a pro career. And he became 2-time WBO world champion, and he ended up even had a 12-round fight with Chavez where he lost. But again, it's a claim to fame to even go 12 with Chavez at that point.
Well, Paulie, where do we put a guy? How does this work? How do we fit this round peg in a square hole with Joe Calzaghe?
Yeah,
Welsh Italian
guy, but he's Welsh.
Well, the word is oriundi, right? I was mentioning you guys, and in Italy they mentioned this word oriundi. Oriundi means Italian descent, but not Italians. But they have a word for those guys. Oriundi. Like you and I are considered oriundi. Calzaghe is probably the most well-known boxing oriundo. Guy. And Calzaghe, but I'd say for the most successful,
Marciano of the old generation.
Accomplishment-wise.
Think about it. Marciano's an oriundo too. If you think about it,
I was going to say
two undefeated guys, two undefeated oriundis.
We didn't even bring up Marciano. Like in terms of the guys who have the most accomplishments, you got to look at. It's probably. I mean, do you put Marciano because it's the heavyweight championship of the world? Because Benvenuti, two division world champion,
65-0,
and Olympic gold medalist. I feel like accomplishment-wise, you probably put Benvenuti at number one or across all across. Yeah. But then you got to go Marciano, and then Pep is right there, and probably number 3, and then Joe Calzaghe, who's
undefeated, best 168-pounder of all time. By most people's estimation,
it's
stayed in the weight class for a long time.
It's possible, arguably. My only argument with Calzaghe is always the level of opposition. He could have chosen it to be a little bit stronger, but the level of reign was so long, and he was always so unbeatable at that weight that you gotta
destroy Jeff Lacey.
You have to find.
He always found ways to win. It's tough when you got a guy who's undefeated, and if you haven't seen him lose, you haven't seen him break, because he would always figure out a way. Those guys are tough to gauge.
You can't help but have to put him in the conversation regardless. Is possibly the best 168-pounder ever, and a lot of people will agree that he is. But as far as Oriundi is concerned, like I said, that's its own culture in general. There's I remember there's even guys who weren't American, like Rocky Mattioli was a world champion, junior middleweight world champion from Australia. And he lost the title to Maurice Hope, who then lost it to Wilfred Benitez. Wilfred Benitez ended up KOing Maurice Hope, but there's a lot of those kind of guys as well. Where they're coming from other countries. Arturo was in Canada. Mention another Italian fighter, Carmelo Bossi. He was a junior middleweight champion back in the 50s and 60s as well, or 40s and 50s possibly. That he was also rather high level Italian fighter, born in Italy. You can have these conversations for those old time fighters. I mean, it'll go. I guess what I'm saying is Italian American culture. If you start going back into the annals of boxing, it was probably bigger.
It helped build boxing.
Yeah, it was probably bigger back then. But nonetheless, there's a lot of fighters you can mention from back then. Even guys that changed their names. Like I think Johnny Dundee. Johnny Dundee is Italian. Sammy Angot.
Willie Pep's name is not Pep.
Willie Pep. It's not Pep.
Papaleo, Sammy Angot. So you start to really turn the pages, and you end up getting lost in the rabbit hole a little bit.
All you can hope is that when you go, there are discussions like this about where your place in the boxing world is. So many people come and go in their particular sport. We like them, we love them, but they're not legends. We lost a legend in Nino Benvenuti, and we're glad to give him his respect. Paulie, appreciate you giving the knowledge of your paisans. And every time somebody goes who has a legend like this, they're going to get their day here at Boxing Scene Today. For Jimmy Smith, the whole crew, we appreciate you. Check us out. Find out why millions are watching.